And welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, sitting in for Riz Khan. The founder and editor-in-chief of the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, has been arrested in London. His detention is unrelated to the release of thousands of secret US diplomatic cables, but his supporters are wondering if this is the first salvo in an effort to bring him and his organization down.
I think that the timing of this has got to be related to the cables. We have to remember that the Swedes dropped any allegations of sexual misconduct against Julian Assange as long ago as September of this year.
Assange handed himself over to police after a Swedish warrant was issued for his arrest on rape allegations. He's been refused bail and will remain in police custody. His supporters say the charges are a smear campaign after WikiLeaks published thousands of secret US diplomatic cables that have embarrassed Washington and forced US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to apologize to some governments. Western governments have condemned the publication of those cables, but WikiLeaks says it exposes the double standards and hypocrisy in international diplomacy. So today we ask, are Western nations out to destroy Julian Assange and WikiLeaks? And what are the wider consequences of his arrest? A reminder, you can call in with your questions and comments. We also welcome your emails and text messages. Joining me now is from Rio de Janeiro, the American civil rights lawyer, blogger and author Glenn Greenwald. He believes WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is helping make global governments more accountable through the WikiLeaks expose. Also with us, former Canadian diplomat Scott Gilmore, who believes the WikiLeaks revelations actually hurt the cause of transparency. And here with me in the studio in Washington, D.C., we have Baruch Weiss, who prosecuted terror cases as a former U.S. government lawyer. Welcome to all of you to the show, gentlemen. Let's start with Glenn in Rio de Janeiro. Glenn, what do you make of this morning's events in London?
Well, the circumstances leading up to it have been extremely strange. I mean, as you indicated in the lead-in, the Swedish prosecutors looked at the case when it was first made, the accusations, and they dropped all the charges and said there was no reason to proceed. Then suddenly a prosecutor in a different part of the country reinstates the charges, and what you've seen now is this arrest is not based on any conclusion on the part of Swedish prosecutors that there's any validity to these charges. He hasn't been charged with these crimes. They simply want to arrest him in order to interrogate him. And the reason that's so bizarre is because his lawyers have been repeatedly now for weeks making him available by having him answer questions over the telephone or appearing through Skype or other technological means. But what the Swedish want is to have him physically in custody in Sweden and even put him on Interpol's most wanted list, which is an extremely bizarre thing to do. And the concern is that they want to get him into physical custody in a country like Sweden that's very subservient to the United States in order to turn him over basically at the request of the Americans. And the concern is that, as we all know from the last decade, that once the Americans get a hold of somebody who's not a citizen and who is accused of breaching national security, that no due process is observed, that all the norms of Western justice are violated. And I think that's the concern that his lawyers and supporters of WikiLeaks have.
Okay, let's get the view from New York. Scott Gilmore is there. Scott Gilmore, do you believe that these charges are a cover to interrogate Julian Assange on the WikiLeaks revelations?
Well, in my previous career as a diplomat, I often found, to my surprise, that conspiracies rarely ever exist, that often coincidence and happenstance takes on the life of its own when it's viewed by the broader public. And so while the timing does seem a little suspect, I don't think that this is a grand conspiracy to get rid of Assange, because arresting him, locking up, putting him in Guantanamo Bay, that's not going to change anything. I think people realize that.
But do you think that what Julian Assange has done, what WikiLeaks has done, serves the wider purpose of transparency in government?
I don't. I think that there's been a difference in what WikiLeaks did before and what they're doing now. Before, they were releasing the gun camera footage of helicopters in Iraq who were illegally targeting civilians. Now they're releasing diplomatic cables. And to paraphrase Winston Churchill, the diplomats are the ones that want to jaw, not war. And what Cablecade has done has undermined the work of diplomats around the world who are working on issues of human rights, on issues of democracy and good governance. And paradoxically, ironically, there's going to be collateral damage from this.
Okay, let's come to Baruch Weiss, who's with us in the studio here. There has been some talk of extraditing Julian Assange to the United States. On what charges?
The charges would presumably be violation of the Espionage Act of 1917, an old World War I era statute that makes it a crime to disclose national defense information. The U.S. government believes that it has international reach and would be able to extradite him here for violating that statute because the national defense information that he allegedly disclosed was U.S. national defense information. They would undoubtedly face a claim by the defense, by his lawyers in that case, that this is the sort of offense that is not extraditable. Political offenses are not extraditable on most extradition treaties, and they are sure to argue that this is a political offense.
And I'm just wondering whether this is just hysteria on the part of some people in government, because, I mean, there's one very senior official in the Obama administration, Robert Gates, who's the Secretary for Defense, who says this is really making a mountain out of a molehill. This is what he had to say. Let's take a listen.
Now, I've heard the impact of these releases on our foreign policy described as a meltdown, as a game changer, and so on. I think those descriptions are fairly significantly overwrought. The fact is, governments deal with the United States because it's in their interest, not because they like us, not because they trust us, and not because they believe we can keep secrets.
Well, that's the U.S. Secretary for Defense there saying that, well, a bit too much is being made of these WikiLeaks revelations. Let's go back to Glenn Greenwald in Rio de Janeiro. Glenn, we heard from Scott Gilmore, who told us that what WikiLeaks has done, what Julian Assange has done, undermines the work of diplomats and international diplomacy. Do you believe that to be the case?
No, I believe that's ludicrous. So let me just address 2 points. One is, you know, Mr. Weiss is correct that if they do extradite him, it would be under the Espionage Act. But think about how dangerous this is. What really happened here is that WikiLeaks thus far has published 960 cables out of the 251,000 that it's said to possess. Each and every one of those cables, with an exception of a handful, have already been published or were first published by the various newspapers with whom WikiLeaks is partnering, such as the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, Der Spiegel, and the like. And so WikiLeaks hasn't actually posted anything to its website that wasn't already posted by those newspapers. So if you want to claim that WikiLeaks ought to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917, as many politicians in the United States are, such as Dianne Feinstein today and the Wall Street Journal, what you're essentially doing is criminalizing the core activity of investigative journalism. The New York Times was threatened with that when they unveiled the illegal spying program of the Bush administration, when the Washington Post unveiled the CIA black sites. The same arguments are constantly made. And as far as disclosure is concerned, what Mr. Gilmore said, think about how much we've learned as a result of the documents that WikiLeaks has released. We learned that the United States deliberately turned a blind eye to systematic torture and human rights abuses in Iraq. We've learned that there were at least 15,000 civilians killed by that war that we didn't previously know about. In these diplomatic cables, we've learned that the United States ordered its diplomats to spy illegally on UN officials to collect their emails and biometric data and passwords, that the British government is purposely protecting the United States and their investigation of the Iraq War, that State Department diplomats are bullying Spain and Germany out of investigating crimes of torture and the like. This is not an attempt to avoid war. This is corruption and deceit that the United States citizenry and the rest of the world didn't know about and would not have known about, but not for WikiLeaks. It's pure whistleblowing and disclosure.
Okay, let me go to Baruch Khwas here with me in the studio, give you a chance to respond to what Glenn Greenwald was saying there. In essence, what stops the U.S. government from throwing in jail any person that leaks documents to the media, whether it be someone from the State Department or from the Department of Defense? And the other thing is, let's not forget that it wasn't Julian Assange who leaked these documents.
Right, that's exactly right. Now, to answer your first question, what's to prevent them from throwing anybody in jail who leaks the documents? From a legal perspective, there's a very important distinction between a government official and a non-government official. If a government official who has access to classified information, who has signed a non-disclosure agreement and thereby surrendered many of the protections that the American Constitution would give him, if such an individual leaks the documents, that person is much easier to prosecute from a criminal perspective for a leak as compared to somebody on the outside. There has been no instance where a non-government official has been successfully prosecuted for leaks. I handled the only case that I'm aware of where the government indicted non-government officials in a leak prosecution. That was a case involving some pro-Israel lobbyists who were who obtained some classified information from high-level government officials who shared it with them. The government indicted them, but ultimately Attorney General Holder dropped that case on the eve of trial. These are hard prosecutions to bring when they're brought against non-government officials like Julian Assange.
Well, let me ask you this then. Is the leaking of classified information a crime in the United States?
I'm going to say it twice because no one will believe me the first time. The answer is usually no. No. There is no statute on the books in the United States that says thou shalt not leak classified information. There is no statute of that sort. They tried to pass one, Congress tried to pass one during the Clinton administration, and Clinton vetoed it, and for a very good reason. And the good reason is that in the United States, there is a huge overclassification problem. There's a huge amount of material that really should not be classified that is.
Well, there are newspaper articles that are classified.
There are newspaper, right. Intelligence agencies sometimes classifying newspaper articles. Their justification for classifying is they don't want anybody to know that they took an interest in the particular article. But be that as it may, if there was a law that said that you go to jail for disclosing classified information, that means some people could go to jail for disclosing newspaper articles, and that obviously cannot be.
Okay, we shall go to Scott Gilmore, but first we're going to have to take a short break. More of our discussion in just a moment. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. On the show today, WikiLeaks and the arrest of its founder and editor-in-chief, Julian Assange. Joining me to discuss the issues are journalist Glenn Greenwald of the US online news magazine Salon.com. He has covered WikiLeaks extensively. The former Canadian diplomat Scott Gilmore, founder and executive director of Peace Dividend Trust, a New York-based charity. He joins us from New York. And Baruch Weiss, a former US government lawyer with the Department of Homeland Security. He's here with me in the studio. Now, of course, the right wing is having its say on the issue. The responses have ranged from calls to prosecute Julian Assange on charges of terrorism to demands that he be hunted down and eliminated. Here are some of the reactions of some US politicians on the right.
He is an active enemy combatant who is engaged in information warfare against the United States. What he is doing is going to have incalculable damage to this country. It is going to have a number of innocent people killed, a number of our allies killed. It's going to put Americans at risk.
I think the man is a high-tech terrorist. He's done enormous,
Assange.
Yes, he's done enormous damage to our country, and I think he needs to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And if that becomes a problem, we need to change the law.
And those are just the mild responses. There have also been calls for Julian Assange to be hunted down and eliminated, and there's been one call for him to be garroted. That was in one right-wing blog. I'm going to go to an email here that we received, and we received this from Tony Brown. And he says, Assange's arrest proves that freedom of speech in the United States is a load of rubbish. Glenn Greenwald, one of the points that you've made is, well, 2 points I want to refer to here, and that is, the first point is that people on the right who so casually call for human beings to be eradicated are the very same people who are so pro-life in their views. And the other thing I want to ask you is, does it surprise you that journalists in the mainstream media have got so angry at these revelations that they are essentially standing behind the government on this issue?
Well, as far as the first question, I mean, one of the things that the so-called war on terror has done is inculcate people with the notion that the American government has the right literally to act without constraints. I mean, we put people in cages for life without any shred of due process. We had instituted a worldwide torture regime. We are currently compiling hit lists of American citizens who the CIA is authorized by the president to assassinate. And so this mindset that the United States can do anything is essentially to vest the government with lawless power. I mean, Mr. Weiss's explanation of the state of the law is absolutely correct. It is at best exceedingly difficult to figure out a way to prosecute WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, and yet you have leading American politicians, and there have been some in Great Britain and even one in Canada, who are explicitly calling for his murder. I mean, law be damned, it doesn't matter if he can be proven to have broken the law, he ought to just be killed because the United States dislikes him and dislikes the things that he's publishing. It's extraordinarily toxic and barbaric, really, to hear how pervasive that mindset has become. And, you know, as far as the reaction of journalists. I mean, one of the extraordinary aspects of all of this is that American journalists love to constantly claim how devoted they are to transparency and accountability and serving as watchdogs over and adversarial checks on political power. And yet here is a whole slew of extraordinarily disturbing improprieties that WikiLeaks has uncovered, and they are bringing true transparency to what the world's most powerful factions are doing. You would think that journalists just instinctively would be supportive of that endeavor, and yet, by and large, American establishment journalists have really led the way in condemning WikiLeaks and leading these 2-minute hate sessions against Julian Assange, and as usual, taking the side of the government, the very politically powerful faction that they're supposed to be checking and scrutinizing, not speaking for.
Right. Let's go to Scott Gilmore in New York. Scott Gilmore, I just want to get back to something you said earlier on when you pointed out that some of the revelations that have been made could undermine diplomacy and the work that diplomats do. I'm going to read you something that was in the New York Times, written by their national security reporter, and he says, American taxpayers, American citizens pay for all these diplomatic operations overseas, and you know it is not a bad thing when Americans actually have a better understanding of those negotiations. He goes on to say, perhaps if we had information on the secret internal deliberations of government prior to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we would have had a better understanding of the quality of the evidence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Doesn't that make a good point there?
It does, and it's a point I agree with, that there are cases where citizens and civil servants need to leak information, whether whistleblowing or they're uncovering some crime or lying on the part of their government. But this Cablecade dump of 250,000 documents, only a handful of those are showing us anything that could be even called remotely controversial. For the most part, I think Americans are getting a sense that their State Department officials are doing a pretty good job. Not only are they good writers, but they're fairly reasonable analysts, and they're often questioning their government. What I'm more concerned about, though, is in those 250,000 documents, there are going to be a lot that reference talks with human rights activists and aid workers and opposition officials. And I know from personal experience that when a brave local activist decides to share some confidential or dangerous information with a diplomat, there can be fatal consequences. I had that happen to me when I was posted overseas, where a local priest who was providing us with information about massacres ended up being killed for doing just that. He wasn't spying, he was just talking to diplomats.
But we know that some of that is not entirely true. Some of what we're hearing from the State Department, some of what we're hearing from government officials. We know that, for instance, that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did offer to share the information they had with the State Department. They wrote initially to the U.S. ambassador in London, and then after that to the State Department itself here in Washington. And he was basically told to get lost. They didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah, and I think that was a mistake. You know, the State Department obviously was trying to negotiate with Assange at that stage, and that was their perhaps a bluff. But given the real risks that are at stake here, I think that they really should have made the effort to accept that the information is out there. We're not going to get it back. So let's do what we can to work with WikiLeaks to try to limit the damage. Let's be realistic about it. And they haven't done that, and now that encrypted document is sitting not only on the in newsrooms in Spain and London and Washington, but is also probably in the Secret Service labs or the Secret Police labs in Beijing and Moscow and Tehran.
Okay, let's go to the phones. We have a caller from Utah, Mitchell from Utah. Thanks for holding on, Mitchell. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I was just wondering why he can't be prosecuted for receiving stolen property. I mean, I remember when someone at Coca-Cola wanted to give information or sell information to Pepsi, and the people from Pepsi were honest enough to help the government or the authorities arrest the guy.
All right, thanks, Mitchell. Well, we have a lawyer sitting with us right here in the studio.
That is a good question, Mitchell. And in fact, almost 40 years ago, with the leak of the Pentagon Papers, when the Justice Department tried to prosecute Dr. Ellsberg, who was the equivalent of a government official then. He was a contractor with the U.S. government at the time, and therefore had access to the Pentagon Papers. They charged him not only with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, but also with essentially stealing government property. That was easier in that instance for many reasons, including the fact that Dr. Ellsberg was charged with actually physically stealing documents, which is primarily what the relevant theft statute is aimed at. It's a little bit harder to bring these sorts of cases when you have what you have here, which is we're not talking about documents that could be physically returned. We're talking about electronic information. And we're also not talking about the person who actually stole the information. We're talking about somebody who received the information down the line. The combination of those two factors is really what, in all likelihood, I think will lead the government, if they ever charge him, not to include a charge under Section 641, which is the section you're talking about, but it is possible. Still, the primary section that we're talking about is the one under the Espionage Act of 1917.
I just want to add a very quick question to that, and if you could just keep it short for us, please. Why isn't the United States government prosecuting the New York Times?
Good question. The government actually takes the position that it could, and under the Bush administration, Attorney General Gonzalez said they could, and the U.S. government's view is it's simply restraining itself out of a sense of executive discretion, but that it could, despite the First Amendment, even prosecute the traditional media. In this case, they're working very hard, however, to paint Julian Assange as somebody who is not a member of the traditional media, so they can justify what they are doing, which is to bring a case against him, but not against the traditional media. Whether that will stand up in the courts or not is a separate question.
Okay, Glenn Greenwald, I'm going to give you the last word on this. We've got about 30 seconds. Has WikiLeaks and Julian Assange been hurt by what's been going on right now?
Well, clearly Julian Assange's reputation has been damaged by the allegations, but more so what's amazing is they've managed almost to get WikiLeaks off of the internet. They've frozen their funds. They've blocked access to receiving donations by pressuring companies not to turn money over to them who are donating, and it's all done without charges. They've been definitely hurt by the government.
Okay, Glenn, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified of upcoming shows, and you can send us your questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, Africa's troubled democracies. As Côte d'Ivoire's disputed election leaves the country in a political crisis, we ask, why is Africa struggling with democracy in many instances? Make sure you tune in for that. See you next time.